Hello, Front Street family. I think I got my camera set. Hopefully it won't fall over. It fell over a second ago. So if we have a blunder, we may just have to delete this and start over. But good morning. Welcome to another week in the season of the coronavirus. I hope that this last weekend found you well. There's a lot of things going on right now, isn't there? On top of this virus, we have experienced the murder of another black man, and his name was George Floyd. And for many of us, this has been yet another wake-up call to what do we do? How do we experience this? How do we walk through this time of unrest? Many of you may have callbacks to when you were younger and you experienced some of the rioting and protesting that took place during the civil rights movement. We're still kind of in that time, aren't we? Perhaps it went away for a season, but the truth of the matter is that we're still in a time where racism and injustice are realities that we have to think about as Christians and walk through together and discover how Jesus is challenging us and calling us to be strong witnesses to the light and life of Jesus in this time. Yesterday and the days before have been filled with all kinds of ideas about what's going on and interpretations of who's at fault and who's to blame and how do we find God's justice in the midst of such precarious times. And today I just wanted to reflect a little bit with you and ease us into thinking about perhaps how we can be faithful in such an uncertain time. What is the call of a Christian in times of injustice and of peril and of seeing so much pain in our society and indeed around the world? So the call, I think, of and the implications of this time, at the very least, is for us to be, for Christians, for white Christians in a predominantly white denomination, is to be listeners. We all come to moments of controversy and injustice, and we come with preconceived notions as to who may be at fault and if reasons for protests and lashing out are justified. And we're face to face again, like I said, with the form of injustice, or injustice taking the form of racism and other isms, perhaps in our time. And so, as followers of Jesus, since these things have been thrust into the center of our attention, what do we do? Because in truth, we can't turn aside from it, partly because it's everywhere you look on the news and otherwise, but also because we've been called to be disciples and therefore we can't turn away from pain. Instead, we must embrace it in some way. And so I offer that perhaps one of the best things we can do in this time is to position ourselves to be listeners. As Christians, we're called to love our neighbors as ourselves, and so if we wish to do that truthfully, we can't approach times like the ones in which we're living with preconceptions and presumptions about the lives and circumstances that are being made known to us. Instead, we have to lead with love. And love is always an active thing. It's an action. Love always seeks the welfare of those around us. It taps into something visceral and innate, built into us in our image of God's selves. And so love always also seeks to understand so that we may, like Jesus, be with others in their pain and see the divine spark alight within them, just as within ourselves. You must love your neighbor as yourself. So often these days, so many of us sometimes inadvertently subscribe to a phenomenon known as the confirmation bias, in which an opinion or an idea becomes so dearly held that we cease to entertain the idea that our opinion or idea could be wrong or could be challenged by another idea. We cease to understand that we may have something to learn and to grow toward in light of something that's happened. The confirmation bias instead causes us to seek out only those sources of information which confirm what we already thought or believed. And so when we double down just because we want to be right about something or to confirm what we already believe about something, that doesn't make us right or solidify that we're right. Rather, what it does is it betrays a particular weakness. The Greek word mathetes is what we translate as disciple. And that most clearly means learner. One who takes on the lives and teachings of another. In rabbinical traditions, it's said that those who wish to go to become like or follow after or be trained by a rabbi, that the idea was to follow your rabbi so closely that you would be covered in the dust from your rabbi's sandals. That's the idea, that's the closeness with which we want to follow Jesus, that we're following Jesus, enacting and doing what as Jesus does so closely and so accurately and ever more in our lives that we are covered in the dust from his sandals. And so since Jesus is that center point, that one from whom we learn and whose life we take on, we have to realize that the faith that we profess in Jesus is a faith that seeks understanding. It's a faith that thrives on wisdom. It's a faith that practices compassionate discernment. Without these tools, what ends up happening is we just looking down at our own feet. We become angry, we become opinionated, and we become unable to relate to others in the way that Jesus calls us to relate to them, which is from a starting point of love, peace, and also with the challenge of the gospel to turn toward Jesus and to live. So as Christians, we're not called to operate under presumption. We're not called to seek to confirm opinions that we already hold dear about an issue or a situation. Now, it may be that in the end we were right, and the way we were thinking about things was pretty much in line with the way things were going, but we can't assume that, is what I'm trying to say. As followers of Jesus, our faith implores us to seek understanding, to relate to others from a posture of compassion, to leave open the possibility for transformation, because sometimes it's not others who need to change their thoughts and ways, but ourselves. I know for me, that's happened more times than I can count. I've made a fool of myself throughout my life. As a pastor, just as a fellow human being, as a Christian, it's happened to me. It happens to the best of us, and it happens to the worst of us as well. But the openness that we are to embody is so that we leave room for God's grace to work in our lives and realize that we're learning and growing just like everyone else. We're just hopefully growing more into the shape of Jesus's life. So from a posture of listening, we become privileged to the lived experiences of others. We become capable of experiencing empathy and of taking to heart someone else's pain. One of the best questions we can ask of a situation or of people in a situation is, where does it hurt? Where are you hurting? Why are you hurting? Have I been in any way a cause for that? Right? And so those things that we are privy to when we enter into a posture of listening are treasure. They're treasures. People are entrusting us with their lived experiences and with their lives. And when we pair that with the foundation of loving our neighbors as ourselves, we are leaving space for God's grace to work and to create in us an openness so that we might have a change of heart, someone else might have a change of heart, but mostly in which our presumptions and our opinions melt away, so that we behold others with a sense of compassion and understanding rather than blame and disbelief. There's a difference between approaching someone from a place of compassion versus approaching someone from a place of suspicion. In the Gospel of John, there's this wonderful moment in John 8 where Jesus is confronted with an accusatory crowd of religious and political leaders who were ready to stone a woman to death because she'd been caught in adultery. So what did Jesus do? I know you've heard this story. What did Jesus do? He stooped down into the dust where the woman had been cast, and he placed himself between her and those who were accusing her, who were disbelieving her, and who ultimately wanted to kill her. Jesus clearly knew that there was more to this woman than her sin. He was more interested in the circumstances which led to her awful predicament. He knew that her sin didn't encapsulate the whole truth about who she was. Instead, he viewed her in light of what she had suffered. And from that starting point, Jesus recognizes that she's a person who needed to be listened to be understood, and ultimately to be protected so that she might have the chance that God wishes for all of us to enter into newness of life because of an encounter with the Lord. I wonder what's been your starting point in light of these recent protests, in light of George Floyd's murder, like too many before him. Face to face with racism and injustice, what's your starting point? Where do we think Jesus would be in the midst of all of this? At the very least, I believe Jesus showed us that he would be among those whose pain was the greatest. Listening, seeking understanding, learning what life was like from their vantage point, feeling with them their pain, and all from the starting point of God's redeeming love, which guides all that Jesus Christ does with and for us. I think that's where we find ourselves today, folks. I think as followers of Jesus, as those disciples who wish to be so close to Jesus that the dust from his sandals would cover us in our lives, that we need to be those who start not from a place of suspicion, not from a place of prejudice, not from a place of presumption, from a place of compassion that seeks understanding, that seeks to feel with others their pain, and to then from that point move a little closer to truth, and from that place of truth begin to act and live in ways that speak to it, that show love, and that ultimately leads us a little closer to Jesus. Friends, I love you. We're living in hard times and there's no easy answers. And yet I think that God is in the midst of this, and I think that we have things that we may learn and grow from. So I invite you to join me in that. And then if you have any particular questions or concerns, you can always ask Pastor Ross and me. We would love to speak with you personally if you're struggling, and perhaps offer some guidance and some community in the way of finding a way forward together. Know that you're not wrestling alone. We're all in this together. And that until next time, which will be tomorrow, I pray that God's grace would be upon you and that you would feel true peace. Go, my friends, in love.